I'm going to call to order the Vision Committee meeting for today, Wednesday, October 18th. And we'll start off with a building code review. And we're going to have a half-hour public forum where we will take comments primarily from the audience. But before we begin that, I'm going to start with Dina and see if she's got anything to say, and then we'll open it up. We're going to hopefully limit comments to 3 minutes. We've got a total of 30 minutes for this, and so I want to give everybody an opportunity to speak. And if we need more time, we'll see if we can work it in. Dina, it's yours.
Okay, just a very brief overview. Again, this is a listening session, primarily focused on any ideas, issues, concerns related to the current building code that the city is using, and with a focus primarily on some of the older commercial buildings as well as some of the older residential structures in the community, to hear some input on that. And then also if folks have any thoughts on uses, so more from a zoning standpoint, uses that they think we should consider adding that perhaps are not currently permitted uses in certain zone districts. So with that, we can open it up.
All right. So we'll, is there anyone in the audience that would like to address council on any of the issues with respect to the building code? If when you come up, if you would please state your name and give us an idea of where you live. Pardon?
I am Bill Hale. I live in the county,
Yep.
but I have a business here in the city. It's 213 South 8th Street, Hale Pet Door. And I've been through the code process. I find that the city does not follow the book on codes, and they're very outdated. They need to be updated. I got a permit application from the city. It is very cumbersome. I just want to put in a couple of walls inside one of my structures. And by this, I have to get a engineer to okay it. I find that just for putting up a partition, it is not necessary to have an architect and engineer involved. I should be able to do it as an owner. And I find that the references in the codes are not accurate, and on the website is not accurate, and I think it needs to be fixed. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Hale. Yes, go ahead.
Bill, do you have any specifics that you could help us with?
Well, the ADA, the website says that they do not enforce ADA. The website says that, and yet you do enforce it. You try to enforce it. They made me put in a parking facility for handicap parking. They did not address any of the issues that ADA wanted me to do. The city and parking area stripe, nobody parks in it. It's in an area that nobody parks in. I use the handicap parking all the time because it's not in any space that anybody uses ever. But the city made me do it. And the city let me get by on a sign. Did not pull a permit on the sign. I set up partition walls, which I think that I can do. but the city said that I needed a permit for that, and they let me go on that. So they made me do some things that I think that are unnecessary, and they let me go on some things that I think that we need, we should do.
But am I understanding you got a current permit that you're working on?
Well, this is a current permit here, yes.
Okay,
I want to set up some more partition walls,
okay. Thanks.
and I can't find an application on the website. It says, number 2, it says download application. Well, I think I found it, finally, but it's not easy, and I don't know how to get to it again.
That's good to know, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's good for us to know, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
My name is Ron Kimmel. I live at 37 Eagle Crest Drive. I've been a light commercial and residential builder for over 50 years. I've been in several different areas with several different building departments. I've dealt with every kind of building official that I think they've ever invented. I've gone to war with some building departments and I've won both cases that I had to deal with. There's a few things that I just 3 things that I put down that I've encountered in here. I've rehabbed several old houses in this town. I did a job with my son-in-law up in the Denver area, and I helped him do that, and I brought back some 2-year-old windows, vinyl windows, that I was going to put in a house here. When I went to talk to Greg, can't do that. They got to be up to specific codes. And they had just changed the R value for the windows, 2-year-old windows that I could update, taking these single pane windows out. Couldn't do it. Single pane windows are still there because I didn't have the budget for that at the time. Another thing, these brick houses, I have a brick house here in town. I can't change the windows in that because they will not meet the egress because they had a lot smaller windows back in the day. No way, unless I cut the brick out, I can't change those windows. Now, why can't I get windows made to the exact size of those openings and use those windows? Nobody's going to cut those windows out, the brick out of those. It's not feasible. It's not economically feasible, or frankly, I'm not going to put that much work into it. Some of these downtown buildings, I own a downtown building here. I put new windows in that 13, 14 years ago. Worked with Greg on that. That's one of the first things I did. There was some question about those sizes. All of the apartments down there had at least one window with a larger size window in it, with the exception of one. Greg was very good about the spirit of the code and not the letter of the code. There's got to be some kind of a situation where it's not feasible to do some of this stuff, that you allow us to upgrade without having to make it economically impossible for us to do it. There's a lot of little things like that that I go through, and it depends on the situation. Sometimes I take these houses, and I've done 2 houses in this town that the only thing I saved was the 4 walls and the roof. I've gutted everything else, and I don't mind that. I'll go in and put the new electrical and stuff like that because I can make that work for me. But there's other times when you just have to work with what you have. And there's got to be a provision in the codes, because too many of these inspectors, that's it, period, end of discussion, don't talk to me anymore. Greg wasn't that way. Greg was the spirit of the code, and he would work with you and try to find a way around it. I don't find that anymore, frankly.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kimmel. Anyone have any comments?
Yeah.
Jim?
I think from my personal perspective and my position on council, that's what I'd like to see achieved is, there are sometimes we need to follow the letter of the code, and there's sometimes.
I agree with that, but there's got to be,
I don't know how we find that balance, but if we stick this out, I think we'll find it.
well, if you've got a house that's already here and it's a situation, it's either leave the old windows in there or you can, you know, and there's got to be some kind of a deal with that.
I agree. I'm just not sure what it is, but we'll find something.
Thank you.
One thing I think is this is probably why we're having this conversation, to narrow down some of the things that absolutely, right, but, right.
Okay. And when you come up to speak, could you sign in on the sign-in sheet just so we have a record? And Valerie?
Hi, I'm Valerie with Dawson Ranch Stables, and I just want to voice my feelings. I could take a whole day to voice them, but I just want to agree, I agree with the two gentlemen prior with their feelings. The codes, there's too many codes. You try to do anything, and it's like you take a step forward and you're getting knocked back 10 because all these rules and regulations, they don't make sense. I agree. Again, I agree. Some of them do make sense, and I am willing to do some of these things. But when it's time and time again, any move I make, I'm told no. And I'm just going to make this public. I have a cease and desist from the city. I am not allowed, as of October 20th, Friday, to live on my property in my watchman's quarters, and I am not allowed to walk into any of my outbuildings. I have several outbuildings that house the saddles for all my trail horses, the harness for my big boys, my wagons, carriages, hay for all my horses. I am not allowed to walk into any of these buildings. I was told this yesterday. Now, to me, this is unreasonable, unrealistic. And I do agree, there are rules. I have filled out packets. Now, I've taken my time on these buildings to get these permits done. I agree with that. But yesterday, I turned in 4 permits. One of those permits, this is the 3rd time I have filled out the packet or turned this back in to the city on one particular building, and it keeps coming back with more and more changes. Well, you need to do this. And as Mr. Bill Hale from Hale Pet Door, you know, he said, the rules always change. You turn something in or you're told something, and the ADA, the handicap, now I'm being told I have to have this one particular building that I've turned in 3 times, now all of a sudden I have to have it ADA compliant. I said, it's for trail riding. I don't have folks, and I'm not trying to be discriminating, but I don't have folks coming up there in wheelchairs that want to ride. I'm told I have to have a painted parking space, just like Mr. Hale, for handicap. I have to have hard surface, which they said is either cement, blacktop, or pavers. This is a ranch, folks. This is a ranch. It's not in the city. I know I'm in the city limits, but this is a ranch. And I'm supposed to now put pavement down and cement. And as soon as I do that, guess what? I'm going to get charged for that. They're going to come out and measure and say the rainwater can't get in the ground here. So I'm gonna be taxed on all that. It's just, to me, it's crazy. And I don't know. You say that you have compassion, that you want businesses in this town, you want people to come and live in this town. And there are several business owners, there's entrepreneurs that have come into this town, and they're being shut down, and they're being run out. Now, I don't know the details of all of them. All I see is boarded up buildings, or I hear that somebody's business is being attacked. And now, guess what? I'm one of them. I have been in this town going on 5 years. And now I'm being told, sorry, you can't be there. Oh, and let me talk about the flood zone. The flood zone, okay? They say my barn is in a flood zone. I had a certified elevation surveyor, whatever he's called, come out and do the survey on where I have my little living quarters. Tiny, 400 square foot in the corner of an existing building. And they're telling me, so I got the survey done because the city wants this. I did it. I am 6 inches above the flood zone from wherever their baseline, whatever it is. I'm 6 inches above. And I thought, good, I'm golden now. I've crossed that hurdle. But no, I'm being told, oh, sorry, you have to be 12 inches above.
Okay.
Now, I just put the sewer in. You all said, you can't live this way, you have to have sewer. You've got to be hooked to the city sewer.
Yeah.
So, what, a month ago, you all were generous enough to help me with that issue. And I've got the sewer done. I've got it connected. $18,000 later, okay? And now you're coming to me and saying, you're out. You can't live there. I don't get it.
All right,
So-
thank you, Valerie.
I'm sorry for...
Jim, go ahead.
Not that we're going to fully debate this issue.
Not that we're going to fully debate this issue, but I'm at least going to throw this out there. You've suggested that just recently we started bringing up on these additional rules and regulations. But yesterday we tried to point out to you that those primary 3 items were listed in your information and the ordinance in 2013.
Yes. The
The
sewer-
information that's a problem with your watchman's quarters started in 2013. And the reason your watchman's quarters is a problem today is because you decided to put the watchman's quarters in the area of a floodplain when the ordinance had directed you to clarify that before you did that.
I am not in a floodplain.
We're not gonna debate that today.
I know, okay.
But-
I'm just saying, I had an elevation certificate done, and it says that I'm 6 inches above.
Yes.
So, but it's
And
still gonna be an
nobody
issue.
changed the regulation that says you have to be 12 inches above the floodplain, if in fact that's the situation. But we need to go back to the original documents, and I asked the public to look at that information. The primary issues that we've got with the watchman's quarters started in 2013. It's not a new problem. We're not changing things, but that whole process started back then. And if it would have been addressed originally, or if the watchman's quarters had been placed in an area that was recommended not in the floodplain, we wouldn't be here.
Yes,
So-
and it goes back to the thing about having the money to do things. I don't remember which gentleman was talking about, the guy with the windows. You're saying, you need to do all this stuff. So if you wanted me to build a house on the 4 acres to the east of us, that's not in the floodplain, it would have cost us thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to get this done. And it was like, this does not make sense. There's a space inside the barn that's there. It already had electric and water. All I needed to do was the sewer. The sewer's done.
I realize that, but the complication is still, as we explained yesterday, that those watchmen's quarters is located inside of another facility, and that particular facility is within a floodplain, and we can't change that.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're gonna need to move on.
Okay.
Thank you, Valerie. Is there anyone else who would like to address council on the building codes? Mr. Turner?
Big George.
Yes.
My name is George Turner. I live at 1514 Vine Street. Yes, I will.
Okay, thank
I
you, sir.
can't write and talk at the same time, really.
That's walking and talking, too.
I addressed the council regarding this issue at a previous council meeting. I made the error of telling you about a small concrete pad that I have on a building lot that, where I tore the house down. And I get billed 64, actually this time it was 66 cents. And I think that's all anybody heard. And that was not my major issue at all. My major issue is that I have a substantial piece of property in the city limits, a number of acres of property. And the water that falls from the sky on my impervious surface never leaves my property. Never. And yet, I still have to pay a stormwater utility fee, which has always been, since it was first initiated, and is today, as much or more than my water bill. Now, I don't mind paying my water bill. I consume that as a service, and I appreciate it. I do not appreciate having to pay a stormwater utility fee on my property when none of the water ever leaves my property. Now, you told us that 80-some% of the properties that generate the floodwaters that we have to be responsible for as a city come from outside the city limits. County properties that no one that owns properties outside the city limits pays a stormwater utility fee. And I'm understanding that you're considering a substantial increase to the stormwater utility fee. I understand you have to generate the revenues with which to build improvements for stormwater. But I do not understand for the life of me why the residents of Canyon City have to pay for all the improvements of the stormwater utility when the people that are generating the vast majority of the floodwater don't pay a thing. And we should not have to pay for that. They should contribute their share, in my opinion.
I will say, on that matter, stand by. Council is in the process of taking action to try to incorporate all of the property owners in the drainage basins that feed into Canyon City.
And George, you are aware that we have had this discussion with the county and the ditch companies, correct?
I'm not sure that.
Okay, so.
We've had the discussion
this is-
regarding the ditch companies, but
Okay, this is an ongoing issue, right? And we all concur that the city is underfunded for the infrastructure in which we have. And that the majority of the stormwater comes from outside the city limits. Yet we're the ones that have to manage that stormwater. So that is something that the council is currently working with. And it's my understanding up to this point that the county is dragging their feet on helping with that. So I would the passion that you have regarding this is something that the county commissioners need to hear, because we need to start looking at this as a county issue, not just a city issue.
is there anything that we can do to assist the city council in trying to persuade the county commissioners that they have a responsibility that they need to address?
If you can vote, you will be able to help assist us.
Well, I think too, that having an awareness to county commissioners that Canyon City citizens are very concerned about this and that they want to see a district that's includes everyone in this area and not just Canyon City residents that pay 100%. That
Okay,
they,
but
if they
we-
can
we-
recognize that.
We have digressed from the building code
Yes,
issues
that's true.
into.
I'm
storm-
sorry, I
Give
thought
us,
that was
give
an
us
issue
five,
that
give
was
us
being
5
discussed
minutes, and we're
today.
gonna jump to that topic.
Yeah, that's the next topic.
Can I correct, can I make a correction? I
Sure.
think. And Adam, jump up if, where's Adam? George, I think you said 82% of the water.
I said 80-some%.
I think it's 80-some% of the area and not the water. Because if we knew exactly how much water was coming from the county, that would help. But it's the area.
Did I
but
say
it's not-
water?
I thought you said water.
I thought it was water. I thought it was 80% of the
We'll come back to it.
water. But, yeah.
So
I'd
Now
like to know how
you-
you're
now we're
keeping all your
both
water on your
confused.
property, though.
I'm sorry.
All
thanks,
right.
George.
And I have all kinds of empathy for Valerie.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. If you want to speak, come up to the microphone, please.
You're up.
Please, sign in, please, and give us your name and an idea of where you live.
My name is Jim Waltman, and I live at 333 Evelyn Drive here in Canyon City, where in fact I've lived for the past 18 years, or 17 years or something. And it's a pretty good city. I like living here. I like the services. I like the businesses. And one business in particular I've really become very fond of, and that's Dawson Ranch Stables. And my wife and I adopted a little wild Mustang up in northern Wyoming, and he's very special to us because I saw him on the first day of his life. I don't want to go too far afield, but saw him on the first day of his life, this little guy, and he's very special to us. So we shopped a long time for a place to keep this, our little Mustang. And we found Dwayne and Valerie Williams' place at Dawson Ranch Stables to be the best place of any place in the entire county. In fact, probably in several counties. He gets special care there as if he's part of the family, which I believe he is. And it really hurts me to see what the city is doing to Dwayne and Valerie. And I'm going to, just my perspective, I'm a customer of Dawson Ranch. I've been there a year and a half. And I've seen what the city has been doing. I've seen what appears to me as just total harassment of these good people. And I just don't understand it. There are so many businesses in Canyon City that have shared the same thing, that they've been harassed by the city for being in business. And I thought that the purpose of the city was to bring businesses in, which of course would bring tax revenues in, and bring in people who are going to pay more taxes because they're going to be employees. But what I'm saying is to see a complete reverse of that. And just from my own observations of what's happened at Dawson Ranch Stables, I'm just flabbergasted as to why the city is so adamant on destroying this business. I mean, that's from my perspective. Again, just from my own perspective, okay? But that's what I see. I see a business being destroyed by a city government. And then I got to ask myself, is this America? Do I live in America, or did I step out of America when I crossed that welcome to Canyon City sign? Maybe that was it. But I thought that I lived in America.
All right, thank you, Jim. Ashley?
So
I just want to make it loud and clear.
you'll have to speak up, please.
So I just want to make it loud and clear that we like the Williams and we love the Dawson Ranch Stables and the business that they bring to Canyon City. We recognize that so wholeheartedly that for the first time in our history, we actually gave them a loan to help them financially to be better. And with that loan, it came with some conditions that they had to meet.
I was here that day. You
Yes.
gave them the loan. That was
And those
wonderful.
conditions, and by the way, they still can run their business. Their business is not shut down. They can continue to run it indefinitely. It's just at this time, they can't live in the watchman's quarters. And for some of those reasons, they come from mandates that we don't have control over. It comes from state statutes and requirements that if we don't meet those requirements, it can put other citizens at risk of losing their floodplain insurance if we don't follow their rules. Also, for fire safety, if we don't meet certain and enforce certain fire safety requirements, we lose our ratings, and then homeowners insurance goes up throughout the entire town. And also for sewer hookups, that's required through the EPA. And if we don't follow those guidelines and requirements from them, it puts the city at risk of fines and being in contempt of their requirements. And so it's not that we're being mean or vindictive, but we're trying to protect all of the citizens of Canyon City by dictates that are given to us from the state or the federal government.
Well, thank you for your thoughts. I've lost my voice a little bit.
Mr.
But thank you for your thoughts on that. But from my observation, again, I'm just a citizen. I'm just a plain old citizen who happen to live in Canyon City there. And I see this policy is not uniformly being administered throughout the city. You know, I've in fact saw a place where we were thinking of buying it for rental purposes, and I looked at it and it said it was in a floodplain. Well, why are people living in it? Why is it a multiple, and this is a condominium. I won't say where it is because I don't want you guys chasing them down to get them booted out. But
Well,
Federal
it's what happens is,
there's no uniform enforcement.
because
You- it
what
seems like-
happens
It seems
is,
like you guys are really just zeroing in on a small business
if
here.
there is a
Thousand
house
Rand
or a
Stable.
business in a floodplain and they choose to make major renovations to it, that triggers them having to come up to current codes and standards.
Okay,
It's not in our hands,
Yeah,
it's
we
in the
need-
federal
oh.
government's.
we need to move on to the
Well,
next.
Thank you for my.
I'm going to take one more comment. If you come up to the microphone, you're going to have to be brief because
Dennis, can I address this other thing for just a moment, please?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I was a member of Planning Commission in 2013 when this came to Planning Commission. As far as the Watchman quarters go, everything was very well laid out. Everybody played well together. There were deadlines given that were more than adequate. And then the things that were supposed to happen, they didn't happen within a guideline. So I think things were moved forward. But like I said, I remember very well when we did this. And everybody was happy, everybody was agreeable, and there was a timetable, and the timetable hasn't been followed. And it's unfortunate, I mean, probably for financial reasons or whatever, but there wasn't any new rules put in. There hasn't been any new rules put in. It's just that, like, the sewer system was supposed to be done at a certain time, and it wasn't done. The city stepped in and helped with that. And there's just rules, like Ashley was saying, with the federal government and stuff as far as floodplain, those haven't changed since 2013.
Yeah, okay.
So
We're covering ground that we've already covered. If you can state your name.
I'm Phyllis Waltman. I live at 333 Evelyn Drive. I have my horse at Dawson Ranch. We looked all over the area, and that was the best choice that we found for our horse. We've been there for over a year and a half. We've heard about these things happening at the ranch. They're a little inconsistent. Why would they have to put in their sewer system before they would have to be approved a floodplain? That seems out of order to me. Wouldn't you, if you want to kick them off the property, why would you make them do a sewer system? If you had that in mind, why would you do that? They are in, I want to finish one more. They're in, you call them a watchman's quarter or something. They live on the property. They live with these horses. They are there to watch the horses and make sure that they are safe day and night. And I really appreciate that. And you're going to eliminate that. I don't know if there's any other place that actually, has that available. There's not a lot of horse property around to rent from. But why didn't you address the floodplain thing before you addressed the sewer thing? That doesn't make sense to me. It sounds like harassment. to me.
Okay, you've made your point, Jim, and then we're,
This session is not intended to be a Dawson Ranch support session, and I appreciate that support, but I ask anybody involved in the issue with the Dawson Ranch, to get a hold of the city and to get a copy of the timeline document that we've had here, and make for sure that you're educated about the situation.
Yeah.
And once you're educated about the situation in terms of what the city has tried to do and what Dawson Ranch has not done, then let's sit down and have some real meaningful conversation. I don't have any doubt that they're probably the best horse boarders in the area. And I've done some work with those people, and they're excellent people. That's not the issue. The issue is following city guidelines, the same guidelines that we expect Mr. Scott to follow in his business. So it's not any different.
What
So
about the
let's move on.
okay.
property we
I'm
wanted to
sorry,
buy?
We're done. It's,
What about the property we wanted to buy that was in a floodplain? People were living there.
You can buy
Thank
a
you.
house in
hey,
a floodplain.
okay, look, this is not,
You're right.
this is not a floodplain
it's frust-
discussion.
yeah, it's frustrating.
This was
People
building
are-
code. Okay, we're gonna move on to the next. It's, yeah, if you want a copy of those documents, come down to City Hall and fill out a records request, please, and we'll get those to you. Okay, Harry, water rates and stormwater fees.
Yes, Honorable Mayor Pro Tem, members of the City Council. Raplace financial consultant was retained by the city in April of this year, and to prepare the water and stormwater rate analysis. Andrew Rahim is the project manager for that project, and he's here to share with you the result, of these water and stormwater analysis. City staff, Adam Lancaster, Bob Hartzman, myself, and all entire finance staff was involved in the process. We provide the data, what was requested, and he has compiled the information and come up with the result. He's here to share that information with you. With that note, I will introduce Andrew Rahim to, take
Okay,
over.
yeah.
you, Harry.
Thanks, Adam. Make sure you got a microphone in front of you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to switch spots just so I can advance the slides. We've got a
Sure,
presentation that you have in your packet.
And then, yeah, I'll get it. There's no music. All right.
Thank you for the time, and certainly, Harry, thank you for the introduction. As indicated, the intent of tonight, I believe we've got about a little over an hour, or a little less than an hour, I'm sorry. But the presentation's about 20 minutes, and certainly we want to have plenty of time for discussion, questions, and feedback. The focus is around the city's water and stormwater funds and enterprises, and a study we are engaged to complete. So this is, we're going to focus a little bit more on the bigger picture in terms of the overall financial health of the utilities, needs, both in the form of capital as well as just continued increased operating costs, and in doing so, how that may influence and affect our primary revenue source for these two funds, which are our user charges. We're also engaged to evaluate the one-time plant investment or impact fees assessed to new or increased development. And so while we're going to focus a bit on the big picture, there's a component of our evaluation and subsequent discussion where, as we narrow the alternatives and what we're trying to accomplish and the amount of capital that we're intending to fund, then we will be back to talk about specific rates for service and those that would potentially go into effect April 1st of 2018. So this agenda kind of covers the topics, and I'm going to start a little bit with just an overview, both of the study, but more of the criteria we're using to identify the need to adjust rates and revenues. Then focus a bit on each of the financial plans separately. We're going to talk about stormwater first, and then talk about the water fund. And then do a bit of an overview and a preview of a subsequent discussion that's around the next step when we look at the specific rates for service and timing for those rates. As indicated earlier, certainly this is intended to be discussion and questions, reactions. At the end, there's some direction that we're looking for that'll help us kind of narrow things down. As you'll see, we've got multiple alternatives. So we don't want to then develop multiple rate alternatives on multiple financial planning alternatives. It grows exponentially, and then it just ends up being too many alternatives to really be looking at. So this diagram depicts the study we were asked to complete. And this type of work, the firm I work for and my own background, these are the types of things that I do every day. I've been doing it for about 14 years and work with communities primarily in the Southwest personally, Colorado, Arizona, large and small. And so the study and the process that we're going through is very similar to ones that we complete for other communities throughout the state and throughout the country. The 5 steps are intended to really, a lot of times people begin the discussion asking about rates. And while rates are the mechanism from which we recover revenues for our enterprise funds from customers, they're often the last component of these types of studies. So as we began, we laid the foundation of understanding what we were trying to accomplish. And the focus, while it's step 2, we've gone through 3 and 4 on a preliminary basis, but really that second step in terms of the size of the capital program, the sort of mix of funding, we've got some options there in terms of the types of funding and how that may influence the timing for rate adjustments. So that's going to be our focus here, and then we're going to preview and talk about steps 3 and 4. Ultimately, the decisions will be around what types of rates and fees to implement, and as we get to that spot in our subsequent discussions, we want to make sure that as we get to the end, we're trying to accomplish what we set out to do. This is just a reminder, it came out of the Dodd-Frank Act, a requirement for municipal advisors to register that provide financial advice. My firm has done that, and we're going to be talking about some level of debt and debt issues, so this is just to indicate that certainly before the city goes to issue debt, to work with financial advisors as you have in the past. And while we're not an advisor that would sort of take it to market or structure the loan, we certainly work with utilities and evaluate debt and debt covenants. So as we set out on this study initially, we identified what would serve as our guiding principles. There's no perfect rate structure. There's no perfect rate. There's often conflicting goals that we seek to balance, and certainly made up of different users. But the principles that we developed for this study is first and foremost having sufficient revenue to fund the needs of the systems, not just today, but out into the future. And as these are utilities, capital and capital projects are a big component. So we're going to talk a bit about what that looks like under alternative capital scenarios, but first and foremost, sufficient amount of revenue to operate these funds and do so in a prudent manner. We're also looking for stable revenues. While we have volumetric components, particularly on the water side, we want to have a predictable stream of revenues so that we can plan and complete activities around the enterprises. There's a cost of service element that when we look at rates and charges, that we want to recover the cost as best we can in proportion to the demands that those users, our customers, place on the system in an equitable and fair manner. While some communities in Colorado, efficient water use and water conservation is a very near-term present goal because they may be facing a significant water supply acquisition. In the city, I'd say that is maybe a less significant goal, just given the history and the water rights portfolio that the city has that is a great asset and great advantage to have. But it's still important to promote efficient water use so that customers aren't necessarily wasting water, because it certainly does cost to treat and deliver water to the end user. And as we evaluate this, these sets of user charges and rates and funds, we want to do so being mindful of minimizing customer bill impact. And we're talking a bit about this today, as well as there's a trade-off in terms of what we can fund. And unfortunately, if there's a need to increase funding, some level of customer bill impact can be expected. So when we evaluate both the separate utilities, we're really trying to accomplish three things. And so this slide lays out those three things. You know, talked about financial stability a little bit earlier, but ultimately the first step is funding our annual expenses. And they include operation and maintenance expenses. We've got debt payments in the case of the water fund, capital improvements that may vary year over year, and other requirements, transfers, franchise fee or payment in lieu of taxes, those kinds of things, just cash outflows as these are businesses. The second two components get to additional financial criteria and thresholds. The first is a debt service coverage requirement that is an annual test. And so when we look at rates and user charges, particularly on the water side, there's an element of unknown where weather can affect demand. So we want to design and establish our rates so that we're not just making our debt payments, but we're setting it to have revenues after operation and maintenance expenses sufficient to pay 130% of debt and debt service. Now keep in mind, and we're not going to dwell on this too much, but our capital requirements from the priority of the loans come after our debt payments. So even though this is above the debt payments, we've got cash uses most years and certainly identified to use that revenue. So this is really just if a requirement in some cases, but also a condition of many loans where the lender wants to ensure that they're being repaid. And so they will put this condition if the city were, for example, to go and get a loan with the state and the state revolving fund, they would have a very similar condition and requirement tied to the financial performance of the fund that's borrowing the money.
Let me interrupt here just real quickly. Are you saying or suggesting that on an annual basis, year after year, our revenues should exceed 30% by 30% our debt service? Because we also have a 30% reserve fund.
Yeah, this is.
I mean, after 3 years, you'd have.
I'm going to jump ahead to just a slide that I had in the hip pocket that I think will help explain this a little bit better. So bear with me while I get there. Okay. So this particular test is revenues less O&M divided by annual debt service. And it's a very common requirement. The state loans that I mentioned would require the city to, as a legal covenant, annually to have 110% of that annual debt service payment. So this is before capital, and while cash reserves are certainly another criteria or target, this is really just sort of a test that says, okay, I'm going to make up some numbers. If we had $1 million in revenues and $500,000 in operation and maintenance expenses, we've got $500,000 that then is available to pay debt, fund capital, and do other things. But we're going to take that $500,000 and say in this example we had an annual debt service of, say, $250,000, then that would yield a debt service coverage of 200%, or 2 times that annual debt service. So we'd be well above what, in this case, this target of 130% is. And that condition itself would not drive the need to adjust rates. But over time, that can sort of tighten up, and that can influence a rate revenue increase. The other component, as you were alluding to, is, let me jump back there, is the cash reserve. So the debt service coverage can get a little technical, it's not always intuitive, but the cash reserves are more directly kind of driving the recommendations. And as indicated, the city has adopted policies where there's really 3 components. There's one that targets 20 to 30% just at cash at the end of the year of our annual operation and maintenance expense. This, if the city didn't have this in place for the utility funds, we'd recommend that that be applied. And this is really, these are businesses, so this is really working capital. So any kind of business, you need to have a little bit of cash to pay the bills as our expenses and revenues may fluctuate throughout the year. In addition to that, there's capital reserves, which I'd characterize the first as more of a checking account. Capital reserves is more of a savings account, where we want to have on hand cash so that if something comes unexpectedly, where while we do our best to plan for capital, there are unforeseen, unexpected sort of, things break unexpectedly. So to have cash on hand to immediately be able to address it to a certain level or up to a certain extent is very wise and prudent. And the city has established that for the water fund to have $1.6 million on hand. So in tandem, that checking account and savings account, if you will, provide a cash floor from which we don't want to drop below. Now, there may be years where we've got well above that amount, but with one-time capital that may kind of go up and down where it's not the same amount each year, some years we're going to draw from that, and the plans that we're going to talk about a bit, we've identified, and that future kind of where those two cross may be out in the future, but that is in many of these funds, many of these scenarios we've developed, that's what's really driving the need is blending the two. Funding expenses, meeting reserves, and then in the water fund, evaluating, making sure the debt service coverage is above the target as well.
Then currently we also reserve one payment, and the subsequent year payments, we also put it in the reserve.
Okay.
So we have one payment for the subsequent year is in the reserve. In addition to the capital reserve, the operating reserve, and we have one payment for subsequent year for the debt payment is
Got it.
also in the part of, and the remaining balance is 30%.
Oh,
So
okay.
we have pretty good.
Yeah,
you know,
so
reserve.
we're sitting pretty good overall.
Thank you, Harry, for the clarification, the addition that, that is an additional component that's not up on the slide. So to look at these, and we looked at each utility separately, we forecasted out a 10-year period. And so I know that the budget process is ongoing, and certainly the city's done a lot of work to identify the 2018 budget. I don't know if it's been fully adopted quite yet, but we incorporated the 2018 budget, the estimated 2017 year end in terms of our expense side, and project water usage, stormwater usage, well, not really usage, but impervious area and revenues over a 10-year period. So we're looking a little bit beyond next year, and while the financial condition for the city may be very good right now, depending on the level of capital and capital plan, and or just inflationary increases on our operations, that at some point, any system's gonna run out of money without revenue increases that can come through different mechanisms. So we're going to start with the Stormwater Fund. And there's a fair amount of some numbers, but in general, the Stormwater Fund's got some more, I'd say, sort of significant challenges relative to the Water Fund. It's a little newer, and the capital needs and the gap between what we're funding today compared to those capital needs is a little bit sharper, a little bit bigger. The Water Fund's a little more mature, and so some of the adjustments we're looking at are a little more steep or significant on the stormwater side. So before we talk about the projections over the 10 years, we wanted to talk a little bit, for those that may not know this, a little bit of the history. That the city has had a stormwater utility rates in place for a little over 10 years. And as they were implemented and adopted, they were really focused on the acronym is National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit requirements. And there was some education around that. There's certainly operating costs and maintenance costs related to the stormwater system, but there wasn't a significant amount of capital that was provided within those rates or those user charges. So around the same time, the city engaged in a master plan to evaluate and help identify what the capital needs may be, and evaluate the system versus the design criteria and really the service level that the city would like to have for the stormwater utility and stormwater fund. So as part of that study, roughly, and pretty big numbers, but it identified through 8 drainage basins, $60 million in capital in needs. And so as we look at evaluating, incorporating those requirements to include not just the current operations, but also starting to fund some of these needs, that's where we're indicating that there is a need to increase revenues and rates in order to fund them. So we're going to talk a bit about different levels of capital funding and what that translates to in terms of user charges and needs, and how we want to fund those. This is blank, but I know in the packet and the printout, there was a basin diagram that tried to take what I just said in the 8 drainage basins and those improvements and identify them a little on a map, a little easier to see. So I know you all have that in your packets. And, you know, our role was certainly more about the funding and funding needs. So there may be questions about particular projects or basins, but I'll defer to Adam and city staff in the discussion period around, you know, addressing those and answering those. Because we were tasked with, you know, ultimately looking to fund those needs themselves. So when we talk about the major projects for water, are going to be a little bit different, but for stormwater, we've got some state-driven improvements. So some capital improvements that are driven based on state projects that, you know, the city is a partner with. Over the 10-year period, that's roughly $1 million in capital needs. There's another kind of layer of miscellaneous, you know, additional sort of stormwater improvements or replacements of existing infrastructure that totals over that 10-year period a little over $2 million. But the final area is around these 8 different basins and the previously identified needs that really, you know, in large part have not been completed, have not been funded today. So we're looking at a pretty big number, $58 million potentially over this 10-year period. Now, the plans that we've developed and we're talking about today, really only one of them does all of these. And the main reason is because the impact and the need to adjust rates and revenues so sharply in order to say right away provide funding for $60 million in prioritized capital is so significant that we looked at other options to kind of phase there a little bit over time. This challenge didn't just show up overnight, so solving it overnight certainly may not make as much sense, and going back to one of our principles of minimizing customer bill impact where we can. So the 4 scenarios, and I know subsequent slides, we're going to see the 3 starting with scenario 2, but we've got 4. And the first one is the one I just alluded to, where we're funding the $62 million over that 10-year period. So we're not trying to do $62 million in the first year, but that is a big driver to really have an annualized number of capital there in that first year and really start aggressively pursuing capital projects. When we get into the other 3 phases, we've got additional kind of constraints, if you will. So under scenario 2, we're really trying to phase that capital in a little bit more gradually over time. And so we've got annual rate revenue increases identified in the Stormwater Fund. And those, combined with funding our other requirements, operation and maintenance expenses, the other needs I alluded to, we're funding about 1/3 of that capital that we are in the first scenario, or roughly $23 million over that 10-year period. Under scenario 3, we're constraining our revenues. After the first year, there's an initial increase that's identified in 18, but after that, we've capped it at a 9% increase a year. And constraining the revenues means that in meeting the criteria of our cash reserves, funding expenses, we're able to fund $12.5 million in capital. The last scenario sets aside much of that prioritized $58 million in drainage basin improvements, and is what we're describing as kind of the steady state or status quo, where we're really doing a minimum level of capital to replace things, do things as needed, but in terms of the service level and getting into that service level goal and what it'll take to get there, we're not really addressing those directly. So over the 10-year period, we're funding less capital. So as we look at the rates and the user charges around these funds, I want to just you guys to keep in mind that there's a trade-off. Scenario 4 is going to have the lowest rates because we've got the lowest amount of needs. And scenario 1 is the sharpest or the largest increase. So what we've done here, and we know that stormwater is billed monthly, but to put it on par with the current water billing cycle for most customers, we looked at this on a quarterly basis. And it is a 10-year plan, and so while we may be requesting more than 1 year in terms of rates, I don't believe we're going to be asking for council to adopt a full 10-year plan. It is important to kind of look beyond, because with capital, sometimes there may be something in, say, years 6 through 10 that would influence what we want to do in years 1 through 5. So today, the typical bill for a customer with is about 3,700 square feet of impervious area per quarter is around $20. So all plans start there. That's today in 2017. And if we were to adjust and fund the $23 million in capital, really embark on that plan, that would result in a pretty sharp increase. And in 2018, quarterly bills of $65. And so there's a need to kind of correct a bit suddenly in the first year. But after that, the adjustments are a little more gradual. And just to speak kind of 4 years, 5 years out, and then at the end of the 10-year period, that plan would have us at $163 per quarter. And certainly above what it is today by a good margin, and higher than the other two plans. So to focus in on the middle line, where we're constraining the adjustments after the first year, a little less steep of an increase, but still identified a $48 quarterly bill, or adjustments to get the bill at that level for this typical customer. And then less significant adjustments whereby at the end of the 10-year period, that quarterly bill would be just under $100. And it's important to keep the final scenario, really the status quo, in mind, that we're not just necessarily looking at the increases over today. If we were to just be able to fund what has been identified as really minimal needs and replacing facilities we have and doing some levels of minimal capital, we'd need to double the rate initially, and that would increase the funding where we're not necessarily identifying the need to adjust that further. So that gives a point of comparison that is, say we look at that second scenario with a $48 quarterly bill. I'd rather compare that to the $40 bill, because that's really our other choice. And the rates and the funding that's in place today with the needs that have been identified just isn't sustainable. The fund will run out of money with the expenses that are in place today. So there is a need to adjust as well as provide some additional funding for some minimum levels of capital. This is also one of the reasons why we wanted to have this discussion before we then develop, say, rate alternatives, because if we've got multiple, say, capital plans, we're going to want to have a more narrow set of scenarios to then look at ultimately user charges and rates.
These calculations are all based on the assumption that this cost is borne entirely by the properties within the city limits, correct?
Correct.
Okay, how easily is it done to adjust these, assuming that there is the formation of a district or something that would incorporate other property owners?
Yeah, we hope to have some of that data. We're starting to crunch some of that now, so we'll hope to have some of that at the next presentation.
Okay, because I'm going to say, this is unrealistic for the residents of Canyon City to bear this burden. I mean, that's out of the question, I would say. So, okay.
We're working on that.
Yep. Okay.
To clarify, the gold or the constrained option, is that comparable to number 2?
Yes, the constrained is on the previous slide, scenario number 3. So the gray bar, what is titled cash phased, is equivalent to scenario 2, or the plan that funds roughly $23 million in capital. And the constrained funds about half that amount, $12.5 million over the 10-year period. So we, already started talking quite a bit about different, kind of amounts or numbers. To translate this into, as most folks deal with things like this, a monthly budget or a monthly amount, the minimal plan, the status quo, translates in the first year to a $7 a month increase for, again, this typical user. Now, users are going to vary a bit, but as rate adjustments, rate revenue adjustments kind of increase over time, for the other two scenarios where we do have future rate revenue adjustments identified, that monthly amount accumulates and it adds up. So the gray bar, the $7 a month, because we're not anticipating and projected a rate increase beyond 2018, that's why that's staying at that flat level. But as things accumulate for the other two scenarios, say that constrained plan, it's $9 a month initially, and 4 years out in 2022, that cumulative amount, so as we're adjusting rates really each year, it's $16 a month, more than what is being paid today. And that becomes $25 if this full plan is implemented through the 10-year period under that plan. To compare that with the more significant rate revenue increase scenario where we're funding more capital, or the yellow bars, out in 2026, it would be $47 more per month, 10 years out. So kind of pulling that all the way back, the initial year of implementation would be $15. So as we're increasing rates, we're just adding to it. And this yellow plan kind of staying there, the cash phased, it's $2 to $3 a month in the first 5 years that those additional rate revenues generate in terms of increased bills for this customer. And then that becomes about $4 to $5 a month in the out years, just as things accumulate and grow. As mentioned earlier, we didn't chart scenario one with $62 million in capital funding because the increases were so sharp that it kind of changed the scale of the graph and was more significant than these. So, don't know that that's as practicable of a plan, but it really does identify where the needs are, and if we were to correct right away, what it would take to get there. So I'm going to switch briefly into the water fund and talk about some of the similar sort of drivers and outputs. As I mentioned earlier, water fund's a little more established, been around longer, and so the needs, that kind of gap between the needs and the funding we have today is a little less sharp. So these are some of the major improvements, and I know we're pressed for time, so I'm not going to talk through these in great detail, but we can certainly answer questions about these. This is the amount adjusted for inflation. It does cover the entire 10-year period and some of the major needs, but not necessarily all of them. We did look at some similar scenarios, and the first one was to cash fund the identified needs that equate to roughly $4.5 million in capital. We're under the same pressures of fund operation and maintenance, debt payments, the other drivers that we talked about earlier, but capital can often drive the needs of these utilities. So under the first scenario, we're not anticipating issuing any debt, and we're planning to fund this with user charges, water fund revenues entirely at roughly $40 million. Under scenario two, we're funding the same capital, but we're anticipating issuing debt as we go through the process for roughly half of it. And that helps reduce the rate revenue requirements because we're repaying the debt over a period of time. While there is an interest component, we're spreading it out over 20 years rather than essentially funding the principal all in the 10-year period as we're doing under the first scenario. Scenario three is also constrained a bit. And while the title, this should just say cash fund, And this will help explain the outcomes a little bit more. And I know it went out with saying cash and debt, but under this plan, we're anticipating fully cash funding the roughly $30 million in capital. So a little bit less than both the other scenarios, but we're in the same way that we're constraining, say, that stormwater plan, we're constraining the amount of capital that may be funded with capping the amount of rate revenue increases in a particular year. The final scenario is to really look at minimal improvements, what we've termed as a status quo, and the minimal improvements over this 10-year period have been identified at roughly $22 million. So what we're looking at in terms of the bounds and the ranges is one plan that funds $22 million in cash over the 10-year period, and another plan that does the same thing, scenario one, with twice as much capital being funded. In between the scenarios 2 and 3, generally land in between those two components. So this gives us an idea of quarterly bills. Like any utility that has a volumetric component, ultimately the bills are going to vary based on the user. And so this identifies an average or typical residential customer that uses 10,000 gallons a month and has a 3/4 inch water meter. Today, the quarterly bill for that customer is roughly $96. So as we looked at the most significant 100% cash increase plan, in the 10th year, the bill a little more than doubles by cash funding the capital over time. The orange bar, and really the other three scenarios in the near term really aren't that different. It's over time as kind of the needs accumulate that we start to see those differences. So up until about 2021, there isn't a significant difference between those plans in terms of the ultimate bill. But starting in 2022, we start to see that the constrained plan starts to catch up with and pass the status quo or current plan, kind of the minimal needs, as well as the plan where we're funding a little bit more capital, but issuing debt to help things along the way. And so by the end, if this plan were fully to be implemented, the 100% cash funding or the constrained funding, the rates get to about the same spot. But by having larger increases earlier, we're generating more revenue earlier. So the 100% cash or the blue bars does generate more revenue, and we've got more ability to sort of fund capital, if you will, through this 10-year period because we're increasing bills and rates faster and generating that revenue a little more quickly. So to translate these into a monthly amount, we looked at this in a similar fashion where the 100% cash plan, the most sort of steep set of rate revenue increases, would mean $6 a month for the same customer over what is being paid today. All the other plans initially translate to $3 a month for this customer, but as we saw previously, but just depicted a little bit differently, over time, these three plans, as we're funding different amounts, start to change a bit. And the debt and cash plan initially starts to lead the other two a bit, but by the end, that cash constrained plan and those bills sort of pass it. And we're able to fund, by issuing debt, the same amount of money, same amount of capital as we are under the cash funding plan, but the trade-off is that we're paying it off over time, and certainly beyond this 10-year period. So as we continue through the other steps, and we've done much of this work, but as we refine it based on some of the direction we're going to receive today, we're looking at the one-time capital recovery fees and also user charges. I guess maybe in the interest of time a little bit, maybe jump to the discussion, and then if we've got questions about, say, cost of service, we can either address that at a different time or talk about that in the next discussion. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but certainly the rest of the charges get to the additional analysis or really talking about the rates and rate alternatives. Okay. One place that we do want to stop is in terms of the customer makeup and the different groupings or classes of customers that the city serves. So like many municipal systems, and this is slide number 22, we're made up, most of our accounts or residences are residential customers. And for the city, that's roughly 86% of customers on the system. And just these are the number of accounts. And then, as we can see, we've got really two groupings of commercial. We've got a commercial multi-unit and just more typical commercial or non-residential customers that make up really most of that other 13% of our customer bases. We've got three other groupings: municipal, golf course, and two group users that, independently are less than 1% of our customers. But we want to talk about the volume sales. So while the number of accounts for residential is, say, 85%, they represent 40% of the water sales. And commercial, similar, kind of the inverse of that, where almost 40% of the water sales are from 9% of our accounts. The multi-unit customer class, which not all cities maybe would have that. It's a little unique for Canyon City, but they comprise over 10% of our use, while being 4% of the accounts. The last component, and we can see the city and the golf course, certainly big users relative to the number of accounts. The last component I want to highlight here is that the system costs, when we have a water system, we put in infrastructure to meet peak demands. And so those customers that irrigate, most of the time those are the peak users, our irrigation demands. That capacity that is there to serve those summer uses is idle in the wintertime. So those customers that have the biggest gap between what their peak is relative to their year-round use are really the most expensive to serve. So we've calculated and shown the peak day to average day requirements for these groups of customers. And the highest peak to average day users are primarily the irrigation users. The municipal, while there's more than just municipal or park watering that's done within that class, those peak demands relative to those average demands mean that, individually as a group, that's the most expensive set of users we have on the system to serve, because that capacity they need in the summertime is idle the rest of the year.
Excuse me.
Yes.
We don't have that slide, or do we?
Yeah, it's page 22.
22 page.
Sorry about that, I jumped ahead too quickly.
Page numbers are
Got
tucked
it.
The other item that we want to highlight is, when we look at residential, they peak, but maybe less of a degree compared to, say, commercial or those primary kind of irrigation customers. The other piece of this is the multi-unit set of commercial customers that, while they represent 11% of our water use, they're a little bit more efficient to serve today. And one thing to keep in mind, as we learned as part of the study, that many of those customers had recently installed, or since the last rate study, more efficient water using devices. So this relationship may have changed a bit. They may be using a little more water, a little less, a little bit more efficiently than they were, say, the last time the city evaluated the water system in a similar study a little less than 10 years ago. So this additional item we wanted to highlight as well. This is very preliminary, and it reflects one of the financial plans. It reflects the debt and cash financial plan that identifies, in percentage basis, roughly a 10% increase in rates in the first year. So from a system standpoint, we've got a 10% gap between what our needs are and the cost of service that's been identified and what the current user charges are anticipated to produce. When we look at the individual customer groupings, we're going to see some deviations from that, where, for example, residential, we're identifying the need to increase not just 10%, but if to achieve or recover the cost of service, we're looking at almost a 15% revenue increase from that set of customers. You can see the percentages where commercial is a little bit more significant, where essentially we're under-recovering from those customers today. Conversely, the multi-unit customers, based on their demands today, we're over-recovering from them. And on a percentage basis, certainly the municipal and golf course are the most significant percentage-wise under recovery, but keeping in mind that residential customers, commercial customers, provide the bulk of the revenues for the system, that over, say, roughly 85% of the revenues are provided by those users or those customers, with some of the, under recovery maybe in place today, but a little less revenue that's being generated.
Can you please explain why for the municipal golf course that the revenue that they generate is so much lower percentage-wise?
I'll take a crack at it, but Harry, feel free to jump in as well. As I understand it, I think it was around 2012, the city was looking at modifying and really calling out those users as separate users. Previously, they had been just sort of part of the general commercial class. And so the rates that were implemented for those two user groups in 2012 were such that that's what's driving the revenue recovery today. I don't know that those rates were necessarily designed directly to recover the cost of service. There may have been some other drivers in that decision at that point in time. But essentially, with that revenue change, what we're identifying is that, that's a policy decision that may be maintained, but if that's the case, then the other users in the system are essentially helping fund some of the needs that, say, the municipal and golf customers place on the system.
Yeah, so some history there, and Bob, you can correct me. So when Cotter Corporation converted from a raw water delivery to the treated water delivery, that was at our encouragement, and they didn't need treated water. And so we cut a deal with them on a cut rate. And then the golf course thought it was only fair, since they were being served by the same water main, that they received that rate too, the Shadow Hills Golf Course. Okay. Then when the new golf course was built, they argued that they should pay no more than the current golf course to be competitive, and the city agreed to that. Then a little later on, when that was reevaluated, it was argued that the citizens shouldn't be paying more to water the city parks than private entities were paying to water private golf courses. And so it was decided at that time to make all those rates the same. So that's how all those ended up the same.
Kind of backed into it.
Correct.
But if you look at the undercharge from all classes, it equals $568,000. And if you look at the undercharge just to those two users, the city and the golf course, it equals $574,000. There is your problem. Some classes are subsidizing other classes, but the net effect is a drain of over $500,000 in needed revenue, and the two parties that are enjoying that benefit are the city and the golf courses. Is that equitable? Is that fair? Is that prudent? Is that sustainable?
Right.
Kick them out.
So are you saying we need to reevaluate 2018 budget?
No, these proposed rates we're talking about would take effect in April of 2018. So we won't require a decision today, but in the next several weeks, we'll come back and try to get some direction as to what these rates should be. But this is one area that really jumps out at you. Should these other classes have to subsidize the city and golf courses?
But it would still change the budget.
Yeah, it still would change our budget.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll change the enterprise. We haven't even established the revenue for the stormwater because it's in a deficit position. You have the choice of bad and worse in that respect. And if you look at the stormwater issue, at the worst case, you're looking at a doubling of existing rates just to meet O&M costs, and that would cause ratepayers to pay an extra $84 a year. The best case from the standpoint of meeting true stormwater capital needs, because we've just got a finger in our dike right now to really get ahead of the curve. At the minimum, you'd want to invest the constrained option of $12 million over the next 10 years. You're looking at a $108 increase annually just for stormwater. That's almost the equivalent of a 200% property tax increase, just to put it in those terms. And if you really wanted to get progressive, you would opt for the phased-in capital at 23 million, and now you're looking at $180 a year. So the least you can do is the 84, that's the least. Because you can't allow the enterprise to be in a deficit position. It cannot be subsidized by the general fund. It's a going concern like any business. It will become bankrupt effectively if more cash is not infused in that system.
I've got a couple
Yeah.
questions. I'm just, the first one's a curiosity question, sort of. On the very last page of our packet, there's a current rate sheet. And why is the rate for commercial multi-use so much higher than any other rate?
It's subsidizing municipal and golf use.
Well, no, but why is it higher than commercial rate? Who cares if it's commercial multi-use or commercial single?
When that was done, again, that had to do with the demand on the system. So if you have 4 users crammed into the same amount of space as 1 user, they have a greater demand on the system.
Yeah, these are apartment dwellers. And they're generating a net positive recovery of over $500,000. Every other class is paying less than the true cost of service. This one class, apartment dwellers, who one could argue can least afford this, are paying the most. While a golfer is getting subsidized to play golf.
So commercial multi-use is, multi-unit is actually residential. Is that what you just
Some
said?
No, some are, but not
Part
all.
residential,
Yeah,
part
yeah.
commercial.
Yeah.
But all
So
your
like a
apartments
strip
in
mall
this
would be a
class.
multi-unit.
Yeah.
Right, so it's basically rental, commercial, it's a
Lot of-
residential. I mean, we don't have a hell of a lot of strip malls here, but we got a hell of a lot of apartment buildings.
Right.
Yeah, this is largely.
So this is a
apartments.
tax on apartment renters,
Exactly.
No, this is a user fee.
a user fee on a, yeah, of course, if it was tax, we would have voted on it a long time ago.
Shame on you.
It's a penalty. Okay, the other thing, and I don't know, Bob, you might be able to answer that. I can't remember exactly. Well, we've never had a dramatic water rate increase, but we have had water rate increases. And have any of these analyses taken into consideration the fact that when you dramatically increase rates, consumption is going to go down?
That's always a concern. And, I mean, I think our last rate increase was in 2013. I think it was like a 3%
Yeah, it was
adjustment across
a
the board.
3%, basically negligible.
Right, and previous to that, the rate increase involved when we did our last rate study, changed the rate structure, and it was recommended then that, again, like with the golf course, that those, if you never changed rates after that, that you adjust the golf course rates at that time to get them up where they belonged. And those decisions were not made.
Yeah, so is there any colloquial or otherwise information that would sort of address the anticipated reduction in consumption as a result of rate increases? Because, you know, if you increase it 3%, most people are going to say, whatever. It's if you increase it 20% or 100%, it's a fairly safe assumption that consumption is going to drop dramatically. It's not going to just a little bit.
I mean, I would agree with you on a very large rate increase might have that effect. You know, rate increases maybe anywhere from 3 to 10%. You might not see that. I mean, a lot of people still enjoy their Kentucky bluegrass. They're not about to, you know, go and pull it out and rock the yard because that water bill went up by that amount.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at some dramatic increase, I mean, you always have that concern.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking, if you're looking at a 9% rate increase year after year, I don't.
That could have an effect
Yeah.
year after year after year, sure.
It's, somewhere along the
valid.
way, that's going to need to be taken into consideration.
And I compare this, both water and stormwater, to our streets. Once you fall behind the power curve on revenues meeting your expenses and stuff, then when your expenses get so large that you're requiring these large rate increases, you're really in a bind.
So, and these capital improvements that discussed in here, what are those primarily? Is that water main replacement, or is that?
A large portion of it is water main work. I mean, we've got several miles of undersized water main throughout the distribution system. We've got, based upon our master plan of building our 12-inch grid and our 20-inch grid, we still have that to complete. One of them identified was the 14-inch Veterans Park line that ruptured out on the highway. We've actually taken a section of that water main out of service in fear of another water main break like we saw earlier or last year that causes a lot of damage, not only to infrastructure but to private property. And so a lot of these capital improvements are centered around the distribution system. However, we've also got a lot of capital needs at the water treatment plant. The equipment up there continues to age, get older. As you all know, mechanical equipment will fail given time, and the improvements we made in 1998 when we constructed the pre-sedimentation facility, all that equipment is now 20 years old. And a driving factor in the industry as well is obsolete equipment. We've got equipment, for example, down at our raw water pumping stations in the electrical hardware, the MCC stuff, that if several years ago we lost a 1200 amp breaker, which is one small component of that, and we were lucky to find a replacement for that. And so we've got aging infrastructure at the water treatment plant that we need to keep up
Well,
to date.
and here, just recently, we refinanced the
Right.
water bonds, and
Yeah.
that generated $1 million. That
Which went into
was
water mains.
Primarily what went into water mains to stay ahead of the street.
To keep up with the
2A street project.
Right.
The immediate question is, how are we sitting with respect to funds for water main replacement to stay ahead of 2A next year?
I would say at present rates, probably about 2A would be about all we could do, and that's it.
But next year, we will stay ahead of 2A?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Jim?
On your planning scenarios, you make reference to $40.5 million. Where did that figure come from? Because it doesn't go back a slide?
Yep.
My calculator doesn't come up with 40 million.
That's not all of them.
This
Those
is
are
just the
a
major
select
ones.
few. Those are not all of the capital improvements that I identified in the 10-year plan.
Okay.
Is there any questions from the West 40?
That's important to note also on the stormwater. Those numbers for the stormwater CMP were just based on the guess percent increases that would be palatable. So those don't tie to any project whatsoever. They're an arbitrary number based on what could be done with that particular increase.
What are our water rates like when we compare them to other communities, like Colorado Springs or Pueblo or
Yeah,
people that aren't on our system?
Back in 2015, I know I did a rate comparison. I looked at City of Salida, Westcliff, Penrose, Park Center Water District, Pueblo West, Board of Waterworks Pueblo, Carr Springs Utilities, City of Fountain. And the only ones that were cheaper than us was the Board of Waterworks Pueblo. Everybody else was, you paid more.
Like percentage-wise, do you have just a number?
We've got at least a snapshot
they've got
for
Just came up.
10,000 gallon customer, so that similar profile we're talking about. That quarterly bill is $96 in Canyon City. And as Bob was indicating, Pueblo Board of Waterworks is in a similar area for water bill, and different users at 20,000 gallons, the relationship may change a little bit just depending on that rate structure, their tiered rates. And the only other one in the area that we looked at is Gunnison. Gunnison's a little unique in that within their history, And I think going back to some of the agricultural roots of the community is they've got a raw water system, really a ditch that goes throughout the city, and it's not just watering ag, but it's also people, are using that to water lawns. So their water rates tend to be a bit lower because they don't have quite the same kind of peak system that most municipalities throughout the state have. But as Bob indicated, certainly, the extreme with Fountain, 10,000 gallons per quarter, 30,000 gallons per quarter, 10,000 per month would translate to a $280 bill for City of Fountain. That's an example of a municipality where they're really, have a water resource need, where that's driving their costs a bit more significantly than, say, Canyon City, that's got very old, very senior historical water rights.
Is that fountain project based upon their current problem or their previous?
This is based on the rates that are, in place today in 2017. So if they adjust them in the future, then, it's likely to go up.
Fountain has a stormwater fee, doesn't it? I thought there's Fountain. Or is it, they don't, or maybe it's Fort Collins that I was thinking of.
Fort Collins certainly does. Fountain, we didn't identify, I don't believe that there is one there, but we'll certainly confirm and make certain that they don't have one.
Scott?
Thank you. Was it not 2015 when we last raised those rates, when you brought that before the last council? I could have swore we had this discussion. You had said 2013,
Oh,
but.
yeah, it may have been
Okay,
2015.
and I was just curious what that percentage of increase was. I don't know if you had that in front of
I
you.
thought it was a 3%.
I agree. I thought it was 3%.
Was it 3%? Okay.
3%.
So that did just happen,
2015.
It happened in 2015.
Yeah.
Second, I'm just curious regarding Florence. When I would get a water bill out there, it was significant. I want to say it was $100 or close to $200 a month for a fourplex out there, and a big chunk of that payment was debt service. Can you? What is that all about? And how does that relate? Because I noticed that Florence is not on this list.
Yeah, I believe, I don't know this for a fact, but I believe it's repayment for their new water treatment plant they built in the south of town.
Okay.
I understand that too.
Okay. And
That's for that new plant.
And that's, there's a small municipality that, it's a huge bill.
Yeah, I think it's like
So it is a huge bill,
$34 a
and
month or
they're
something.
They're running a $500,000 deficit in their
Yeah,
water fund.
okay. So, and again, we had this discussion in 2015, and I always felt that as far as water goes, we were sitting pretty.
All right, I'm going to step this back to stormwater, because I got a question about that. Unless, any more about the water rates? All right, the stormwater, I'm just curious, I think what do we got, 62 million in capital improvements identified. What's the basis for calculating that? Is the concept all stormwater is delivered to the river, or all stormwater is it a combination of detention ponds and delivery to the river?
Yes, detention
or-
and conveyance, both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and it's, I don't know, it seems, depending on available land, it seems like detention is certainly infrastructure-wise a less expensive option than building pipes and.
Well, what we're finding is you have to have both, because we don't even have that much room to detain. And
Oh,
so,
yeah. No,
yeah, I
no,
mean,
I-
that's, so that's part of the, an example is we just completed the Northeast Canyon Drainage Study design work for, it has 3 detention basins in there, greater than 10 acres in size. And it still only reduced the floodplain in the Northeast Canyon Basin. It's a forked system, has a west and east fork. It only reduced the floodplain in the west fork, and still didn't even touch the floodplain on the other side. So it's fairly significant without making the downstream improvement as well.
Yeah.
Another example is the Orchard Basin and the Abbey Basin. Both of those have fairly significant ponds, but the outfalls are inadequate.
Yeah, and then maybe it's not an obvious follow-up question, but it's certainly a follow-up question is, I'm presuming those detention basins are within the city. If
No.
they're not.
No.
They're.
The only one that is the Abbey.
Okay.
on that north side. We have some in Dawson Ranch as well. that
So
are
how
in the
did we
city.
get them outside of, if they're not in the city, they're in the county?
Yes, yep.
So how do we do that?
What do you mean, how? I mean, that's where you want to capture the water. You want to capture it before.
Oh,
it comes in.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
So the Orchard one was purchased and built outside the city. We just recently purchased 2 other parcels outside of the city, one on 15th, one on 9th Street, that are in the headwaters area of those floodplains.
Does that require an agreement with the county?
No, it's a use by right in the zones that we purchased.
Because it's our land.
Detention
Yeah.
basins.
I mean, it would have to, final construction and approval.
Yeah,
that sort of stuff.
I
They have
mean-
their own floodplain administrator. It'd have to go through them, yeah.
Yeah, it's, obviously, there's a lot more vacant land in the county than there is in the city.
And a lot of it's undesirable to build on as well.
Exactly, and it's a few big, deep retention ponds, or
Yeah.
detention. Okay, anyhow, just a thought.
Mhm.
But that's all taken into consideration okay.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Sure.
It's yes, sir.
Back to the flood, or to the stormwater and the 62 million, assuming that we were to accomplish that, where would we stand relative to the current stormwater versus ditch issues? How much of that would be addressed in that?
Oh, it would cure a majority of that. Two of those biggest outfalls, 2 of those biggest bases that impact the ditch are Northeast Canyon and Orchard Avenue. Again, we talk about the Orchard Avenue pond. It'll fill up, but its discharge is into the hydraulic ditch.
But the 62 million would rectify?
Yes, part of that plan is to rectify that problem. Yep.
I'm curious, what were the costs? I know it's astronomical, too astronomical to include on the graph charts, but just to put it into perspective, what would scenario 1 be? Early
Rates
bills.
would go up 1,000% in the
Yeah.
first year.
Yeah, it's, I had it right here. Let
Was
me
it 200 a
see.
month or 200 a quarter?
It'd be a $241 quarterly bill. I'm sorry, $261 per quarter, an increase of $241.
Yeah.
And that would essentially, it's not like the plan wouldn't necessarily build the 62 million in 1 year, but as Adam indicated, that's sort of a series of projects over that 10-year period that would have the funding, so we're essentially doing 1/10 of it a year, and funding that, 60 million over that 10-year period.
And on the stormwater funding, is it all a cash recommendation? Was there no cash in debt?
We did, for planning purposes, look at debt, and so there's really 2 drivers there that, when debt would be issued, say, on the water fund, it's issued through certificates of participation, where there's asset that's essentially collateralized. In stormwater, you don't have that same type of asset to put up. So what debt could potentially be part of the solution, but that would, as I understand it, with the city kind of rules, require voter authorization.
Okay.
Yeah, so unless the vote rule changed for the city, nobody wants to buy swampland.
It's
Well,
not an asset.
Depending on what you're doing with it.
I got a piece I'd
Same
be
rule
willing to
applies
sell
for
you.
water.
Yes. Your
Seriously.
soccer fields.
Yes, sir.
So back to if we had 23, phase 2 of 23.2 million, if we were to choose that option, how much of the drainage versus stormwater and ditch problem would get rectified in that option? Do you know? Or could we throw an estimate out there?
Yeah, I think the 2 basins we're talking about, the 2 that really impact the ditch is Northeast Canyon and Orchard, and you'd make a serious dent if not solve the problems with that much. But that's over a 10-year period,
Right.
and so unless you figure out a way to borrow it, you don't build that until year 10. I mean, you could phase portions of it, but a lot of that stuff that's in stormwater, the way you really can't do it. I mean, you could start, but you lose some of your
Have a
economies of
ditch going
scale.
nowhere.
Yeah, every time you hire someone, design, build a chunk. Yeah.
Yeah, you would. That's any other questions?
We just wanted you to have this sink in. And
Yeah.
maybe in a couple of weeks, we'll come back with another meeting to get your input as to what direction we should go on both the stormwater fees and the water fees, and also the class of service cost.
It's, and this may seem like a odd time to bring this up, but I didn't catch your name that I'm sure. I'm thinking you're Andrew Ream, but I'm not sure.
Yes, sorry, I jumped right into talking, and yeah, I am Andrew Ream.
Okay. All right.
He
Well,
did introduce himself.
well, I know, I just didn't catch it. It's, so, well, unless there's any other questions, well, first of all, hold on, we got council and staff informational updates. Anybody have anything they'd like to offer? In that case, we're,
Oh, we got one.
I maybe add, we're getting ready to replace the coating system on the 500,000 gallon tank out in Dawson Ranch, which was identified in our capital plan, and there's some more tanks yet to do that was identified in the work that Andrew's been talking about, so we're moving forward with that.
yeah, actually, it's, I've got two more things I'm gonna touch on, but they're gonna be very quick, and it looks like Jim's got something.
Well, just quick for Bob, can you get me some of the information on the work that's going to happen in Dawson Ranch so I can pass that on to the HOA about the investments that are being made in their district? Thank you.
The first question is, or the first comment is, for 2017, do you have a projected surplus or deficit for the water enterprise? Where are we?
It's surplus.
Is what?
Surplus.
Surplus. Of how much?
Well, we meet our requirement, what we have a 20 to 30% range of the operating maintenance reserve, we have that.
Oh, yeah, no, what I mean is, in 2017, we have X revenue and Y expenses.
Right.
Is X minus Y positive or
Yeah,
negative?
about negative, about 506,000.
Positive.
It's positive.
Negative.
Negative, so
Yeah.
expenses
storm?
exceeded revenue.
Yeah.
Okay.
For stormwater or
The
Water.
water
Water
enterprise,
plants.
drinking
water?
water.
Drinking water is a negative 500?
506,000.
Okay, so, and,
If you go back to that chart, it reflects what the true cost of service is and what you're generating in revenue, and there's over $500,000 gap. There's your gap, and it largely relates to two classes, the city and the golf course.
yeah, well, this is the self-eating watermelon thing or whatever. It's, does assessing the city higher rates on its water solve any problems? Because,
Well, it diminishes the subsidization of the rates by particularly apartment dwellers, because they're paying far above the true cost service. They're basically paying a 25% surcharge. Is that fair?
oh, yeah, no, but I mean, it's,
You're saying eventually they're
the
gonna get
city
charged.
isn't a private citizen. We've got to get the money from someplace too. So if we increase the
True,
rates,
yeah.
it comes out of the budget someplace else. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like you're just Peter's robbing Paul. It's okay.
I just want to
enough-
make one request. Can I get, sorry, Jim. I would like to get some more cost comparisons to other communities for our next discussion as well, if we can, including Florence, Fort Collins, because Fort Collins has an excellent stormwater system, maybe some other communities as well, just so I have a more broader picture to look at.
And that's okay, I just caution you on that, you have to be careful because unless you're comparing to per capita, what their projects are, what their
Cost
water
of
portfolio,
water.
that kind of stuff looks like,
All
it's,
right, well, can you use your discretion in choosing those cities?
Jim.
Water and stormwater, Ashley?
Yes.
This is relative to council update. It's probably appropriate. Ashley and I met with Dawson yesterday. It was a real challenging discussion, and I'm providing a recap. It's not minutes, but it's just a recap that I'll send to Kathy, and then Kathy can disperse to council.
Okay.
Thank you.
The final comment is, the results are in, and the Canyon City Marching Band in the regional competition came in first place.
Yay.
Congratulations.
We're adjourned.